My name is Serena Voss. I'm 29 years old. And the Tuesday my mother moved $6,200 out of my emergency fund without asking was the Tuesday I finally understood that being dependable had, somewhere along the way, stopped being a quality I possessed and become a resource my family consumed. She didn't call first. That was the part one kept returning to in the days that followed, not the amount, not the account, but the sequence. She had my debit card number from 2 years prior, when I had added her to a joint savings account, so she could cover a car repair while I was traveling for work. The account had remained joint. It had simply remained. And on a Tuesday morning in late October, while I was sitting at my desk at the urban planning office where I worked, my phone buzzed with a transaction alert. Withdrawal. $6,200. Remaining balance. $41.17. I stared at the number for a moment the way you stare at something that doesn't immediately parse. The way a word looks wrong after you've read it too many times. Then I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. Her voice had the particular quality it carried when she had already prepared for the conversation. A practiced steadiness, the tone of someone who has rehearsed their reasoning and found it sound. "It was an emergency," she said. "And you always handle things." I asked what the emergency was. She told me my brother Darren's landlord had given him a 10-day notice. That Darren was between positions. That the family couldn't watch him lose his apartment. That I was the one with savings, the one without dependence, the one who had her head on straight. I asked why she hadn't called me first. She said, "Because you would have made it complicated." I held the phone for a moment, without speaking. Then my father's voice came on. She had put me on speaker without telling me, and he said, "You'll earn it back. You're young. This is what family does." I told them I would call them back. I did not call them back. I opened my banking app, navigated to the joint account settings, and removed my mother's access. The process took 4 minutes. The bank sent a confirmation to my email with the subject line, "Joint account access update." I printed it that evening when I got home, folded it, and set it on my kitchen counter. What none of them knew, what I had never explained because it had never come up in a way that required explanation, was what that account actually was. Not savings. Not surplus. The specific, deliberate reserve I had been building since the month I turned 26, when a ceiling leak at my previous apartment had left me with a $1,900 repair bill and no cushion to absorb it. I had built the fund category by category, contribution by contribution, over 38 months. It had a purpose. The purpose was not my brother's landlord. I want to tell you something about the structure of the family I grew up in because the Tuesday morning phone call did not arrive without context. It arrived as the most recent expression of a pattern that had been operational for as long as I could remember, and understanding the pattern is the only way the rest of this story makes sense. My parents, Owen and Diane Voss, had married young and worked hard in the specific way that people work hard when the margin for error is thin. My father had spent the better part of his career as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm in the city, reliable, steady, not dramatically compensated. My mother had worked part-time in the administrative office of an elementary school for 17 years, a job she valued for its schedule and its proximity to people she liked, and which she supplemented with the kind of domestic economy that kept a household functional on a modest income. They were not careless people. They were people who had learned to manage by identifying the resources available and routing toward them efficiently. The resource they had identified most consistently over the course of my adult life was me. I don't mean this cruelly. I mean it structurally. I was the elder of 2 children by 5 years, and I had been, from early adolescence, the more legible of the 2 of us in terms of conventional stability markers. I did well in school. I did not require extraction from situations. I graduated from the State University with a degree in urban planning, passed my licensing examination on the first attempt, and was employed within 2 months of graduation at a firm downtown. I was, by the operating logic of my family, the one with capacity. My brother Darren was 5 years younger and had spent his 20s moving through a sequence of positions and living situations that had the quality of improvisation, not because he was incapable, but because he operated on a much shorter planning horizon than I did, and because the family had, almost without discussion, established a safety net position precisely where his planning horizon ended. The safety net was not financial aid from my parents, who did not have the surplus. The safety net was me, access through my parents, who served as the routing mechanism. Over the 4 years between my 25th and 29th birthdays, I had contributed to Darren's stability in the following ways. A $1,400 short-term loan during a gap between jobs that was never fully repaid. A co-signature on a utility account when his credit score was insufficient. 2 months of grocery contributions during a period when his roommate situation dissolved without notice. And, on one occasion, a $600 cash transfer to cover a car insurance lapse that would have invalidated his license. None of these were decisions I had been asked to make. Each had arrived as a fait accompli, a situation already in motion, a problem already at a particular stage of urgency, presented to me at the point where the only visible options were to help or to watch something collapse. I had helped. Each time. Because the alternative felt disproportionate to the amount involved, and because I had, at 25 and 26 and 27, a functional income and what appeared to be more margin than Darren had. What I did not have, which I had been building deliberately since the ceiling leak at 26, was a floor. The $6,200 was the floor. 3 years and 2 months of monthly contributions, automatically transferred on the first of each month, sitting in an account I did not touch because the entire point of the account was that I did not touch it. It was not surplus. It was the minimum viable cushion between my present circumstances and a situation I could not recover from without outside help. My mother had moved it on a Tuesday because Darren's landlord had sent a notice, and because I always handle things, and because I was young and would earn it back. She was not wrong that I would earn it back. She was wrong about what it was. I work in the urban planning division of a mid-sized city agency, the kind of office that handles zoning variance applications, environmental impact assessments, and the particular category of public comment meetings that run long and produce more documentation than resolution. I had been with the agency for 4 years at the time of the Tuesday transfer. My direct supervisor was a woman named Patricia Aluwal, a 15-year veteran of municipal planning who had a precise, unhurried way of identifying the core of a problem that I'd spent 4 years studying and was still not fully able to replicate. My colleague at the desk adjacent to mine was a man named Theo Baranowski, who had been with the agency for 8 years and who had the kind of institutional memory that made him indispensable in ways that never showed up on an org chart. Theo was the person who knew which city council member's assistant to call when a filing was stalled, which contractor had a history of submitting incomplete environmental studies, and which conference room had a broken thermostat that nobody had filed a work order for. He was also the person I trusted most in the office, in the specific way you trust someone you have worked alongside long enough to have seen them handle a difficult situation without becoming someone you didn't recognize. It was Theo who noticed that Tuesday afternoon that something had shifted. He didn't ask directly. He slid a cup of coffee onto the corner of my desk at around 3 in the afternoon and said, in the conversational tone he used for all significant observations, "Bad one today?" I told him it was a family thing. He said, "Yeah," in a way that closed the subject without dismissing it, and went back to his desk. I appreciated that. I left work at 5:15, drove home, and sat at my kitchen counter for approximately 40 minutes with the bank confirmation in front of me and the particular quality of stillness that comes after a decision has already been made, and what remains is simply the time between making it and acting on it. I was not going to replace Darren's access with my own. I was not going to call my parents that evening. I was not going to have the conversation about what the account was for because the conversation would not resolve anything. It would produce a renegotiation in which I was expected to find a new way to absorb the same situation, and I was no longer interested in the renegotiation. What I was going to do was stop. Not dramatically. Not with a speech or a letter or a phone call in which I listed grievances and announced decisions. I was simply going to stop being the account the family drew on, and then I was going to let whatever that produced produce itself, without my involvement. I made dinner. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. I slept adequately. There are things I should tell you about Darren before I tell you what happened the following Monday, because understanding why his landlord's 10-day notice landed the way it did requires understanding the specific way Darren had organized his life in the 2 years prior. Darren was 24 at the time of the transfer. He had been living in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city for 14 months, in an arrangement he had entered with a reasonable amount of optimism and a lease deposit that my mother had contributed to from a tax refund. The apartment was not expensive. The rent was $1,340 per month, which, on the job he had held at the time, a warehouse receiving position with a regional distribution company, was manageable. The warehouse job had ended 7 months prior, when the company had reduced its receiving staff following a routing software upgrade. Darren had been given 4 weeks' notice and a standard severance. He had, in the weeks following, applied to several positions with mixed engagement, taken a part-time job at a hardware store that covered approximately half his rent, and relied on the implicit understanding, never stated, never negotiated, simply operating, that the family would cover the gap until things resolved. The family in this context meant me. My mother had transferred amounts from the joint account on 3 prior occasions in the 14 months since the account had remained accessible to her. I was aware of 2 of these. The third I discovered only when I reviewed the full account history after the Tuesday transfer. The 3 prior amounts were smaller, $340 on one occasion, $180 on another, $220 on the third, totaling $740 in additions to the $6,200 that had, apparently, been accumulating in my account on Darren's behalf without his direct knowledge and without mine. The 10-day notice had arrived because Darren was 4 months behind on rent. 4 months at $1,340 per month is $5,360. His landlord, a property management company with a standard late fee structure, had added $840 in accumulated fees, bringing the amount owed to $6,200. The number was not a coincidence. My mother had looked at the notice, looked at my account balance, and performed the calculation. I understood this only after the fact. At the time of the phone call, I had understood only the surface of the situation. The architecture became clear over the following days, as I reviewed the account history and spoke, once, to Darren directly. He called me on Wednesday, the day after the transfer, the day after I had removed my mother's access, and said nothing further. His voice had the texture of someone calling from a prepared script that he was finding difficult to stay on. "Mom told me what happened," he said. I asked him what she had told him. He said she had told him the account thing was a misunderstanding, that she hadn't realized I was keeping that money for something specific, that she thought it was extra. I told him it wasn't extra. I told him it was an emergency fund and that I had been building it for 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't ask her to do that." I told him I believed him. He said, "I'm going to figure out the rent situation." I told him I hoped he would. He said, "Serena," and then stopped. I waited. He said, "I'm sorry." I told him I appreciated that. I told him the access had already been removed, and I wasn't angry. I told him I needed him to understand that the family's habit of routing financial problems through me without asking me first was going to stop, and that this was not a negotiation, it was simply what was going to happen going forward. He said, "Okay." It was the most direct conversation Darren and I had had in several years. I didn't know what to do with it exactly, but I filed it as significant. The following Monday arrived with the particular quality that Mondays in late October have in a city that has remembered it is going to be cold for several months. I was at my desk by 8:40, coffee on the corner, a zoning variance file open on my screen, when my phone began producing notifications. The first was a text from my mother at 9:07. "Serena, call me." The second was a missed call from my father at 9:22. The third was a text from my mother at 9:31. "Something happened with the bills, call your father." I set my phone face down on the desk. Theo glanced over without comment. By 10:15, I had 9 missed calls and 2 voicemails. By 11:50, the count was 14 calls. I did not call back during work hours. This was not cruelty. It was the recognition that any conversation I had with my mother that morning would be a conversation conducted under the pressure of an immediate financial emergency, in which I would be asked to resolve the emergency, and I was not going to do that. The emergency was not mine. Its resolution needed to not be mine. I listened to the voicemails during my lunch break, in my car in the parking structure, with the engine off and the windows fogging slightly at the edges. My mother's voicemail was 7 minutes and 40 seconds long. It covered the following: 3 automatic payments had failed on Monday morning. The utility bill at $214, the internet and cable bundled at $189, and a credit card minimum payment at $147. The total of the 3 bounced payments was $550. The utility company had sent an email flagging the account as at risk for service interruption. My mother's voice in the voicemail had the texture of someone who has encountered a mechanical failure in something they had assumed was permanent infrastructure. Not panic, but a genuine, uncomprehending bafflement. The 3 automatic payments had been running from the joint account. Not from an account my parents owned outright. From the joint account, my account, to which my mother had had access, and from which she had been running 3 household automatic payments for a period of time I had not been aware of. I sat with that for a moment. The confirmation letter, which I had printed the previous Tuesday and left on my kitchen counter, had been accurate. The access had been removed. The standing orders, which had been set up using the joint account credentials, had attempted to process on Monday morning and found the account inaccessible. 3 payments. $550 total. My father's voicemail was 40 seconds. He said my name twice, then said, "Call your mother," then said, "We need to sort this out," then said my name once more and hung up. I drove back to the office. I sat down at my desk. I opened the zoning variance file. At 4:55, I sent my mother a text, "I'll call tonight after 7. She replied in under 30 seconds. "Please." I called at 7:15 from my kitchen table with a cup of tea and the bank confirmation still sitting where I had left it on the counter. My mother answered immediately. My father was on speaker within the first sentence. She explained the 3 payments. She explained that she had set them up from the joint account 2 years prior, after a period during which they had reorganized their bill management, and she had found it easier to route them through an account she could access from her phone. She said she had meant to move them. She said she hadn't gotten around to it. I asked how long the payments had been running for my account. She said, 22 months. I did the arithmetic without speaking. At an average of $550 per month over 22 months, the standing orders had drawn approximately $12,100 from my account in the period since she had set them up, on top of the individual transfers I had been aware of, on top of the $6,200 taken on Tuesday. I did not say this out loud. I noted it. I set it aside. My father said, "We didn't realize you'd actually close it. We thought you were upset and you'd come around." I told him I hadn't closed it in anger. I had closed it because it was my account and I had decided to close it. He said, "But the bills." I told him the bills were going to need to be moved to an account they owned. I told him I would help them set up the new routing if they needed help, but that I wasn't going to reopen the joint access. My mother said, the utility company said there could be a disruption. I told her to call the utility company first thing Tuesday morning and explain the payment situation and ask for a grace period. I told her this was a routine thing that utility companies handled regularly. I told her the representative's name she would likely speak to would be in the automated system. My father said, "Serena, this is a lot of disruption over a misunderstanding." I told him it wasn't a misunderstanding. I told him a misunderstanding was when 2 people had different information. In this case, the information was the same on both sides. My mother had known it was my account, had known I hadn't been told about the standing orders, and had made a series of decisions across 22 months that I had not been consulted on. That was a different category. My mother said, quietly, "I thought you wouldn't mind." I told her I understood why she had thought that. I told her that was, in fact, the problem, that the family had operated for a long time on the assumption that I wouldn't mind, and that the assumption had been allowed to compound because I had never said otherwise, and that I was saying otherwise now. My father's chair made a sound. I heard him shift. "What does that mean going forward?" he said. I told him it meant that any request involving my money would come to me directly, as a question, before any action was taken. I told him it meant the joint account was closed and would stay closed. I told him it meant that when Darren needed help, the conversation happened with me first, not after. My mother said, "Your brother is going to lose the apartment." I told her I hoped he wouldn't. I told her he had told me he was going to figure it out, and I was choosing to let him do that. She said, "He can't figure it out on his own. You know that." I told her I didn't know that. I told her that what I knew was that every time the situation had been routed through me before he had the chance to try, neither of us ever found out whether he could or couldn't. I told her that was going to change. The call ended 20 minutes later, with my mother saying she would need to think, and my father saying goodnight in the tone he used when he had nothing further to argue, but was not prepared to agree. I washed my mug. I went to bed. I slept without interruption for the first time in several days. Darren did not lose the apartment. This is the part of the story I want to be careful about because it would be easy to tell it in a way that makes his resolution seem simple, and it was not simple. What happened was this. Darren called his landlord's property management office on the Wednesday of the week I closed the account, requested a payment plan meeting, and was seen by a property manager named Gloria Reyes, who handled delinquent account negotiations for the company. He presented his part-time employment documentation and a written commitment to pay the overdue balance in 3 installments over 60 days. The property management company agreed to the plan provided he paid the first installment, $2,067, within 5 business days. He called me on Thursday evening. He told me about the meeting with Ms. Reyes. He told me about the installment agreement. He told me the first installment amount and said he had $1,400 saved and could cover the rest from his next hardware store paycheck if the timing aligned, but the paycheck landed on the 8th and the deadline was the 7th. He asked if I could cover $667 as a loan, to be repaid within 30 days. I want to be clear about the distinction because it mattered to me at the time, and it matters to how I understand what happened. He had called me. He had asked. He had already done the work of negotiating the plan, calculated the gap, and arrived with a specific number and a specific repayment timeline. I told him yes. I transferred $667 that evening from my personal checking account, not the joint account which was closed, but my own account, through a standard transfer. It was a loan. It had a repayment date. Darren paid it back in full on the 32nd day, with a text that said, "Done. Thank you." My mother called me the following Sunday, 11 days after the Tuesday transfer, 6 days after the installment agreement, 2 days after Darren's first installment had been paid. She called at her usual time, mid-morning, the kind of call that happens on the rhythm of established habit. We talked about her week. We talked about a road project near her neighborhood that had been running for 3 months and showed no visible signs of resolution, which was a subject I had professional opinions about. We talked about a cousin's engagement. At no point did she mention the account. At no point did I. At the end of the call, she said, "I'm glad things worked out with Darren." I told her I was glad too. She said, "I did mean it, you know, that you always handle things." I told her I understood that. She said, "I just," and stopped, and then said, "I should have asked." I told her yes, she should have. There was a pause that had the texture of something settling. "Okay," she said. That was the whole conversation. For letters, a breath, a pause. But it was the first time in the course of all of this that my mother had moved from explanation to acknowledgement, and I noted that too, the way I noted the $667 repayment. Not as a triumph, not as a resolution, but as a data point. A small recalibration in the operating logic of the family. I did not reopen the joint account. I did not set up any new shared access. The family's bills were moved to my parents' own accounts within 10 days, with my father handling most of the logistics and my mother calling the utility company on the Tuesday morning as I had suggested. The representative she reached was named Marcus Hawley, who gave her a 4-day grace period without incident. In the months that followed, the family dynamic recalibrated in the way that I think all family dynamics recalibrate when one person changes their behavior consistently and without drama, not all at once, not with ceremony, but in the gradual, unremarkable way that water finds a new level after something shifts the landscape. My father called more than he had before. Not about emergencies, just calls, the short ones he preferred, about his work schedule or a home repair project or a sports result. They were brief and practical, and they felt, in their brevity, like a different kind of attention than the one I had received before. Like he was checking in rather than checking the account. Darren and I talked more directly than we had in years. Some of this was the phone call, where he apologized. Some of it was the installment negotiation, which had required him to act on his own first and discover that he could. Some of it was simply the removal of the routing mechanism that had previously stood between us. When the family needed something, they had always gone through my parents to reach me, and now that the channel was closed, the conversation had to happen between us directly, which turned out to produce a different quality of conversation entirely. I rebuilt the emergency fund. It took 16 months, which was longer than the original 38, because I was not willing to reduce my rate of contribution to other savings goals in order to accelerate the timeline. The fund reached its original balance on a Tuesday in late February, which I noticed on the transaction confirmation with a specific, quiet satisfaction that I have not tried to translate into anything larger than what it was. A floor. Rebuilt. Mine. There is a thing I have come to understand about the particular shape of what happened, which I want to say plainly because I think it applies to more situations than mine. The joint account was never supposed to be permanent infrastructure. It was supposed to be a temporary measure, a logistical convenience for one car repair, one trip, one specific situation. It had become permanent infrastructure because I had not closed it, and it had become something it was never supposed to be because no one had asked me whether it could. The assumption was that access, once given, was given. That is not how access works. That is how access gets taken. Closing the account was not a punishment. I want to be clear about that. It was a correction, not of my parents, not of Darren, but of a structural arrangement that had outlived its purpose and was being used in ways I had not agreed to. You are not obligated to leave a door open simply because you once chose to open it. A door is not a permanent promise. It is a decision, and decisions can be remade. I had not understood that as clearly at 25 as I understood it at 29. The ceiling leak and the emergency fund had started the understanding. The Tuesday transfer had completed it. Before I go, there is something I want to ask you specifically because I have been thinking about it since I sat in my car in the parking structure that Monday at lunch, listening to my mother's 7-minute voicemail and watching the call count climb. When you heard that the standing orders had been running from my account for 22 months without my knowledge, at what point in this story did you figure that out before I said it? Was it when she called the account extra? When my father said he thought I'd come around? I am genuinely curious, and I read every response in the comments. If this one stayed with you, subscribe. There are more stories here, and every one of them is about the moment someone finally said, "This is mine." I'll see you in the next one.